So you're all very welcome to our Gate 1 webinar focused on how leaders can drive better engagement in a hybrid world. Previously, we have hosted a webinar that looked at the digital workforce and considered technology and policy implications. Today, we're looking at leadership behavior and what you can do to better engage your hybrid teams. While hybrid working offers greater flexibility and work-life balance, it also presents challenges for leaders, such as how to ensure inclusion across hybrid teams, how to understand employees' challenges when we don't see them every day, and how to encourage engagement across mixed global teams. Well, hopefully leave you with a sense of how to address some of these challenges and how to better engage your hybrid teams. So we also have Jess supporting in the background, and Jess is just going to share his presentation now.
Jess is our producer.
Our producer for the day. Very lucky to have Jess supporting us. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Donal Brown. I'm the Accelerator Events and Engagement Lead at Gate 1. I work across the UK and Ireland, and I'm based in London. I'm really intrigued by this topic of engagement in a hybrid world, as I ran 50 virtual accelerator events through the first year of lockdown. And this year I've run a handful of in-person events, and I'm fascinated by the different sort of tactics you need to employ to excite, inspire, and engage teams in virtual, hybrid, and remote settings. Over to you, Neela.
Thank you. So for anyone who I haven't met before, my name's Neela and I'm the Employee Experience and Technology Adoption Lead at Gate 1. So I was previously part of our London office, and I'm now part of our US team working in San Francisco, which is really exciting. And I am personally genuinely quite interested in unpacking what drives engagement and loyalty in the workplace, which is why I'm co-hosting this webinar with Donal. And I've spent the last couple of years helping organizations navigate change programs both through remote and hybrid phases as well.
Thanks, Neela. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Gate 1, I'll give you a very brief overview. We are part of the Havas Group, a global network of specialists in communications, media, and consulting services. And Gate 1 was founded in the UK, but now has a global reach with offices in the UK, Ireland, US, and France. And at Gate 1, we are privileged to have worked with a wide range of public and private sector clients. You can see a small subset of these clients here to give you a flavor of who we have worked with and who we are currently supporting on their transformation journeys. So to ground today's webinar, for the next 40 minutes, we will cover 4 elements. Number 1, we want to hear from you. This whole webinar is around engagement, so we will be practicing what we preach, hearing from you and building a sense of an understanding of how you are managing hybrid engagement. Number 2, we'll tell you about our Gate 1 model. As consultants, we love a good model. We'll bring you through our hybrid engagement model that we use internally and with client teams. We've worked with global client teams, big and small, with a diverse set of challenges. Some have set office days. Some are struggling to get anyone back into their offices. We know how you're feeling. There's all sorts of different challenges that are being faced, and our model hopefully addresses the multitude of those challenges. Number 3, we've designed this webinar to help you take clear action. The third element of our webinar today. You'll hopefully leave today with a sense of what you can do to better engage your hybrid teams. And then finally, we will try and make this as interactive as possible throughout, practicing what we preach, and we'll make sure to leave time for questions at the end. If you do have questions throughout the webinar, please use the chat function and just post your questions there, and we'll address them at the end of the session, but we'll get a good understanding of what's come up throughout. But first, before we begin, where's your energy right now? Whether you're at home or in the office, it's likely you are simultaneously thinking through numerous things on your to-do list. Let's take 30 seconds to recalibrate and bring focus back to this moment. Breathe. Make sure your feet are touching the floor. Make sure you are grounded. Notice the different sounds humming in the background. Breathe. Bring your focus into this session. Hopefully you're now feeling ready and to hear about what we at Gate 1 have observed around challenges with hybrid working and what you can do about it. And I'll hand you over to my colleague, Neela.
Thank you. I personally genuinely really enjoy that sort of recalibration thing that you just did there. It's the beginning of the day for me. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. So my head's at a very different space where you might be in the UK. So to kick off the next session then, leaders are no longer leading the same workforce, and that's because hybrid working has created very new employee expectations and desires. Our mindsets and our priorities, whether they're overall in our lives or professional priorities, have changed in the last 2.5 years. In addition to that, employees have proven that we can deliver in hybrid settings, so they quite rightfully expect for their views and desires to be recognized and heard. So if you take a look at the leap in working conditions in these images, it's quite obvious that moving backwards feels quite unimaginable. So, we're quite unlikely to want to go back into this cubicle setup that we have here in the middle of the page, and we're also quite likely to not want to go back to open plan 5 days a week. So once you've made that leap forward, it's quite challenging to get people to move backwards. And a good leader then needs to be able to respond to these changes to better serve their employees in a hybrid world and to better engage them in a hybrid world as well. So the key point here is that we have all collectively changed and we're never going back. And so what happens if leaders don't respond to these changes? The first thing is that people are quite likely to resign. So throughout 2021, so just last year, there was a lot of conversation around the Great Resignation and the idea that the pandemic itself was driving high turnover and encouraging people to reprioritize what mattered to them. This hasn't really gone away. As we're going back to normal life, people are still very much considering what's important to them and moving on to new opportunities. So this statistic on the page here, 40% of workers are considering quitting their jobs in the next 3 to 6 months. This is based on a study that was just conducted this summer of 22. And something to call out here, compensation isn't the primary driver for people looking for new opportunities. It's the more delicate behavioral components that drive this statistics or initially encourage people to think about moving on to new opportunities. A lot of it can be tied down to how trust manifests itself in a hybrid world, and whether people are feeling like they're being listened to or engaged properly. So, people are thinking, if I no longer feel trusted or connected in this environment, well, why not move on to somewhere else that treats me better? And then for those who do say, there's been a lot of conversation around this idea of quiet quitting. So it's not really a new phenomenon. It's more about people disengaging and embracing a more economical mindset to work, should we say. The statistic here, prioritizing relationships, results in 60% of employees giving extra effort or going the extra mile and only 3% quiet quitting, is really about the way managers and leaders are personally engaged in their workforce. And it's not so much about a lazy workforce or employees who aren't willing to sort of work harder. So if we think about what that means moving forward, as employee needs continue to change and the workplace evolves, what managers need to do, and middle managers in specific, will also need to continue to evolve and continue to be a new challenge for how they're showing up in a virtual or in a hybrid environment.
Thanks, Neela. So as promised, we want this webinar to be interactive, and we want to, number one, hear from you, and number two, give you an opportunity to hear from your peers who are also on this webinar and see what challenges other organizations are facing. So Jess, our producer in the background, is going to bring us over into Mentimeter, which is our polling tool that we use at Gate 1. The instructions will be on screen throughout the webinar, but we will ask you to either flash to another browser or to use your mobile phone, whatever is easiest for you. You can either do it by scanning the QR code on the right-hand side with the camera on your phone, or you can enter the code on the left-hand side, 84013779, and that's on menti.com, menti.com. I'll give it another 10 seconds just to help let people join. We're going to have 2 of these Mentimeter polls in today's webinar and 2 questions within each one. So I'll give you one more moment.
If that's not enough, I've also popped a link in the chat, so you can also click
fantastic.
on that.
Thank you, Neela. Real-time engagement, love it. So you can also use the link in the chat on Zoom as well. So the first question that we have for you is to get a sense of how you're feeling around hybrid engagement. Tell us how you feel about hybrid engagement. It could be 1 word, 2 words, just to give us a sense of how you're feeling about it. Maybe positive, maybe concerned, but just to get sort of ground us today around how you're feeling around engaging in a hybrid setting. So it's still emerging. I think that's true. I think we spent just to ground us pre-2020, very much an in-person by default, and then all of a sudden fully remote by default through COVID. And it is still emerging how we get the balance right. Challenging, nervous, concern, fragile. That's an interesting one. Disengagement. Hopefully, off the back of today's webinar, you'll have a sense of what you can do around disengagement. Still learning the tech. I think technology is an enabler, but very much an enabler, not the sole solution. Tired, imbalanced, lonely. Neela? There's
a real, I think, mix of quite positive and, let's say, even better risks in this, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. There's opportunities, the future, lots of opportunities in there as well, but some real concerns. So good to ground the group. If I ask the next question then, have you seen any challenges in your organization around hybrid engagement? There were some elements of concern, fragile, disengagement. What challenges specifically have you seen in your organization around hybrid engagement? This could be sort of a trickling through of still struggling with the technology, still getting the balance right, too many recorded meetings to watch. But hopefully by you being here in real time, you won't have to watch this recording, but it will be available after as well. But fully agree that we only have so much time in our days. Cameras off, behavioral challenge.
Not enough talk and connection.
Lack of team building, feeling very fragmented and siloed from others. You'll hear about it later in this webinar, but it's getting that channel mix right of when to do in person, when to do virtual, and when to kind of use your channel mix appropriately. That one in the middle is a really big one as well around geography. For globally diverse teams, the ability to get back to offices, but also where people are based is also a bit of a challenge for us to address, and we will be addressing that today. Not enough small talk, connection, the sort of absolutely the water cooler, corridor chats, and just that warm, fuzzy feeling of connectivity, which again is what employees are seeking in their workplaces. Fantastic. Hopefully we will be addressing most of those challenges, but thank you for sharing them with us. That will ground our discussions in your experiences, which is great. Back to you, Neela.
Thank you. So a little bit about what we've seen in the marketplace through clients that we worked with and through literature reviews and across the board. The first one is this idea around technology first. So there's been a lot of focus in making sure that we're leveraging the right technology to encourage hybrid engagement, which is brilliant. We're giving people access to better tooling. However, it's come with the assumption that the behaviors to fully make the most out of this technology are going to organically emerge. And the effort to fully utilize those tools hasn't been consistently there, which then leads us on to the second point. So what we're calling social media baby steps. So it's the idea of leaders and organizations more widely cautiously leveraging social media principles. We've seen companies who very quickly move towards technology that resembles something that you might use in your personal lives to connect with family and friends. So you'll notice things like Facebook Workplace and Teams and WorkVivo and a lot of other applications that use similar features and ways of getting you to connect to what you might use personally. But the key difference there being that a lot of people haven't fully leveraged those wider social communications principles to really make the most of that. So quite simply, that means things like making information more accessible and bite-sized, responding to attention spans that might reduce as we experience information overload, increasing video and visual content to help people get access to that information quite quickly, and recognizing that true connection through these technologies isn't about broadcasting and one-way communication. Posting a newsletter on a communications channel as opposed to send it via email isn't true social. It's around encouraging that two-way interaction. So social media baby steps. The other thing that we've seen is around an always-on culture. So we have seen an increase in messaging around well-being. So fantastic, a lot of people are talking about well-being. We have well-being sessions and webinars and perhaps well-being days, but leaders are still role modeling hyperconnectivity and this always on culture, which of course encourages other people to be hyperconnective and always on, leading to quite porous boundaries, which then leads to poor health. So if we focus on a US statistic for a second, 62% of Americans experience physical illness from work-related stress. So that might be things like fatigue, stomach problems, headaches. They can all be attributed to stress derived from work. And so the idea there is that hybrid is not going to work if employees and leaders are, don't have boundaries and are constantly feeling like they need to be online. The final point then, even though we are always online and hyper connected, people are still feeling quite disconnected from each other on a personal level. And that's because those chance interactions and opportunities for employees to make friends in the workplace, you might not necessarily make a best friend at work, but just to make friends in the workplace, it reduces. So a study published this year by Microsoft and CIPD said that 60% of employees feel less connected to their teams and colleagues than they did in the past. And just think about what that could mean for new joiners as well. So if you don't already have that network, that statistic is going to be even higher. So always online, not necessarily genuinely feeling connected to our teams.
Thanks, Neela. So we've heard there from Neela that hybrid is here to stay. There are considerable risks around employees disengaging or quitting with new hybrid ways of working. And we've seen various challenges across our clients. You heard from each other in our Menti poll around the challenges you're facing and also what we've seen in the market when trying to solve this problem. So you are not alone, but what can you do about it? Employees working in both an in-person and virtual office environment require considered leadership behavior to encourage genuine engagement. That much has always been true. But not getting the balance right allows for porous boundaries between home and work life, significantly increasing the risk of burnout among colleagues. The best way to mitigate against burnout and increase employee loyalty is through building internal community in an engaging way. Successful organizations need to ensure their hybrid engagement makes space for belonging, fun, relationships, and connectivity. And they're the sort of outcomes that all of our leadership behaviors are aiming for, that sense of belonging, fun, building relationships, and connectivity. And employees are seeking these elements, and we have developed a model to help you get there. So this model has been developed based on our research. through conversations with clients, perhaps some of you who are on this webinar, and lived experience in working on virtual, in-person, and hybrid engagements over the last few years. We advocate for leaders to be authentic, be accessible, visibly empower colleagues, and to show vulnerability. You might already be doing these things. The difference here is that you need to make extra effort to show these things in a modern hybrid setting. This may seem challenging to some of you. However, if you do not show these behaviors, you are likely to see changes in your workforce, some of them unwelcome. At this stage, this may feel intangible and abstract. So I and Neela will spend the next few minutes bringing each of these 4 leadership behaviors to life. So starting off with being authentic. We believe employees need leaders to be authentic. Know the needs of your employees and find ways to empathize with your colleagues. Conversations should, as Neela has already mentioned, try to be two-way rather than one-way, and leaders should build in interactivity wherever they can. Just to bring that to life, I'll tell you a story about authentic leadership behavior that had an impact on me personally this year. So I started working on a new project in April. On my first day of meeting the new team in person, having up to that point only met online, our engagement lead, a Gate 1 partner, took me aside for a one-to-one chat. One of the first things he said to me was that he was diabetic. I wondered why he was telling me this. I may or may not have known, he said, but he wanted to highlight it as his blood sugar levels could be erratic, and that could make him, in his words, seem ratty on occasion. He wanted me to understand his situation so that I wouldn't take offense if he was more direct or irritable in some moments, but also so I could empathize with what was going on in his world and his situation. He was also conscious that when working remotely, we can appear more distant or impersonal in our interactions. He didn't need to tell me this, but this immediately instilled a greater sense of empathy. We cut through some barriers and I felt a greater sense of connectivity with my new team. So I just wanted to share one minor personal experience of how authenticity impacted my own engagement this year. So we've heard around authenticity, but just to sort of ground how we're framing some of the top tips that we're advocating for you to take away. So leaders from different contexts require different options for engaging their teams. For example, big and small teams might need different interventions, local versus global, mostly virtual versus mostly in-person, all very different challenges and balances to get right. At Gate 1, our leadership development and coaching practice, or LDC, have been encouraging improved leadership behaviors for years. But what we are now emphasizing are behaviors we need to dial up in this new hybrid context. We will share a full list of top tips with you via email after the webinar. So don't worry about capturing all of these. We'll have them all neatly packaged up for you at the end of this webinar. But I will call out one per lens here where we consider 3 distinct roles. Number 1, for larger teams, consider the leadership values you want to emphasize and how to reinforce these in a hybrid world. Be consistent, even repetitive with these anchors. So say it in person, say it through virtual sessions, repeat your values. It's even more of a challenge to get them across in a hybrid world. Employees will be seeking reassurance that your values live across virtual and in-person contexts. Number 2, for smaller teams, it may seem obvious, but it has become more challenging with hybrid. Carve out time, virtually or otherwise, for new joiners. Don't assume you'll meet in the corridors. It may not happen, as you may have different days that you're in the office to new joiners. So just make that extra effort to make time virtually, in person, whatever works for you. And number 3, for HR and change supporting leaders, in order to create a sense of belonging, consider moments that matter. And double down effort to authentically impact people's positive employee experiences. These are the small things that we used to capture or acknowledge in person back in our traditional context, But now that we're in a hybrid setting, we need to make that extra effort to make people feel special. When there's a new birth in their family, when they're getting married, whatever it might be, acknowledge those moments that matter. So that's being authentic. Moving on to the second of our 4 leadership behaviors that we're advocating for, being accessible. We believe employees need leaders to be accessible. You need to get the channel mix right, know when to do one-to-ones, video, all staff mails. When we talk about video, it can be short and sharp, snackable content versus fully recorded webinars like this one. They're very different ranges in what you could do there. But you will need to do a mix of these. There's no one way of doing things. And I think relying solely on one may bring you risks down the line. So consider when to make messages available across global time zones. Showing up for different regions makes an impact to a sense of connectivity and belonging. I noted one person listed that as a challenge in our Menti poll early on. Globally, teams, if I used Neela and I as an example, Neela's day starts as mine ends. And I think with Gate 1 global comms, it's always a good idea to acknowledge the different regions and not assume everyone is accessible and attentive at the same time. In practice then, just I won't tell a personal story as I did last time, but rather just cover more of a sense of what it means in theory. So this is more of a challenge in a remote or hybrid setting than it may have been pre-COVID in more traditional in-person office environments. While previously, pre-COVID, leaders could have been present, visible, or held off-the-cuff chats in corridors or at people's desks. Now, leaders need to make considered efforts to be visible to teams. More communication is asynchronous, which refers to not real time. That could be formal emails, collaboration platforms such as Microsoft Teams or otherwise, or shared documents even. They're all asynchronous in that people can collaborate on them, but it's not real time. You don't have that human connectivity that you might do with real time in-person or virtual Teams calls. So, and those asynchronous communications, such as formal emails, can work well to reduce a sense of uncertainty, but may not build that sense of humanity, connectivity, and belonging that you might get from real-time communication. So hybrid offers us the chance to balance this out with genuine interactivity and connectivity. Employees need leaders to offer in-person town halls, as much for building real social relationships with their colleagues as much for communicating information. And employees need leaders to share information with a mix of real-time video calls rather than just formal emails. This again increases connectivity and trust. And just before I hand over to Neela, I'll bring you through some top tips for being accessible. For larger teams, consider how you're personally role modeling and leveraging technology to best collaborate and communicate. I noted again, one person mentioned a challenge around still getting to grips with the tech. It is an enabler, and I think for it to be best utilized, our leaders need to use it in the way they want their teams to use it as well, and to live by what you're hoping for teams to do. For smaller teams, be real about your boundaries. When can people expect to access you? When should they expect a delay in responses? Just don't be a hero, and please look out for yourself with clear communication of when you are and are not available to team members. And then this in turn should encourage others to do the same. And thirdly, for HR and change supporting leaders, for important hybrid meetings, consider creating a pre-briefing for anyone who will be dialing in remotely and or buddy them up with people attending in person. I think again, just breaking down those barriers between in-person and virtual team members is always a wise thing. And now I'll hand you over to Neela.
Thank you. So the third component of our model then is to visibly empower. So employees need to see leaders who empower them and their teams in a very overt way in hybrid settings. And we've spoken about this concept in the past. So about 18 months ago, we ran a webinar around the idea of employees feeling like out of sight might mean out of mind. And what this means is if not done right, employees feel like they need to work longer and harder to feel like they're making an impact and to feel like they're being recognized whilst not necessarily being seen face to face. Which then means leaders need to factor in how they visibly empower their teams and individuals in a more explicit way. So what does this mean in practice? It could be something as simple as inviting your employees and teams to share success stories themselves, and providing opportunities for more diverse voices in your next leadership meeting, for example. It's a very deliberate way of showing recognition and celebrating wins is by giving them a voice to play back what's gone well for them and what's gone well for their teams as well. In terms of top tips then, so we will be sending this round. There's quite a few on this page, but I'll just pick my favorite one from each one. If you are a leader of large teams, the idea of how you're leveraging storytelling for recognition is really important. So are you balancing stories about people and performance from both face-to-face environments and hybrid environments as well? If you're a leader from small teams, are you seeking multiple perspectives? So it can be quite easy to pick stories from people who are around you constantly or people who you talk to on a daily basis, but you'll need to work a little bit harder to elicit some of those stories from quieter people and provide recognition there as well. And if you are a HR leader or like myself, work in change and you're supporting leaders to think about these concepts of visible empowerment, you might want to think about how you drive leaders to think about more outcomes orientated performance as opposed to recognizing visibility and presenteeism as well. And we'll go on to the final part of our component, which is actually potentially my favorite part of the component. So if you're a fan of Brené Brown, you'll have heard her talk about the concept of leadership and showing vulnerability in the workplace and how crucial it is to creating trust. And I think this is the behavioral component that's most likely to generate some discomfort in leaders and maybe some discomfort in people in this call as well, because the assumption is that as you're increasing vulnerability, you're decreasing credibility in the workplace. The idea being, if I show weakness at work, people will then question my leadership. But building in vulnerability in an authentic way and in a way that fosters learning as opposed to just oversharing and potentially stepping outside of work norms, it develops trust, which then drives engagement. It fosters psychological safety, which then drives innovation, and it also drives well-being in the workplace as well. So if we then delve into a little bit about what that could actually look like in a hybrid engagement. So it's not necessarily about sort of detailing every aspect of your personal life. It's more about feeling like you can be vulnerable enough to approach failure or situations where things haven't quite gone to plan with empathy and with transparency, so that people can learn from it and so that people can feel like they too can share those stories about when things haven't quite gone to plan. And so we've worked through a significant period of crisis, both with clients and with colleagues. And I think some of the best leaders that have approached this in the past have genuinely just been quite honest about challenges that they faced in their workday. So if it's sort of juggling childcares with immediate deliverables that need to be submitted, or potential insecurities around a big presentations or a big workshop that they're not quite feeling prepared for, is talking those through with your teams to role model that it's okay to do that in the workplace. And then in terms of top tips, so I think before you even get into vulnerability for large teams and small teams and HR and change roles, it's first sort of deciding when leveraging or demonstrating vulnerability is useful for your team. So is this story going to foster learning? Is it going to help me, or is it going to help someone else? So that's the first question you need to be asking yourselves. For large teams, then you might want to think about balancing business updates with more human sentiment. So are your updates purely facts and updates, or are you also sharing about how you're personally feeling about the experience in the business. If you're a leader of slightly smaller teams, then as you have those one-to-ones, whether they're virtual or face-to-face, are you asking questions to get to know, where people's heads are at? Are you sharing stories, and are you creating space for people to share experiences and foster connection? Or are you just going into the to-do list immediately and objectives and what needs to happen next? And if you're in HR or in a change role, so you're supporting leaders, you really want to be thinking about how do you coach leaders to develop psychological safety with their teams. So are you supporting them in developing psychological safety interventions to allow them to learn from vulnerability within their teams? Excellent. So I think we have a few minutes left, and I'll hand over to Donal.
So we're in the home stretch now. Thanks, Neela. I'll do a quick roundup. We'll have one last Menti poll, and then we have time for Q&A at the end. As mentioned previously, we will share all of the top tips that have been on screen today after this webinar via email. Just to share a quick snapshot of some of our favorites. Creating habits starts with small steps. Here's just a few sort of teasers of what you can start doing now to build those habits. So be authentic, know what you stand for, and be repetitive in fostering this. Be accessible. Consider your blend of synchronous and asynchronous communications. Visibly empower. Be deliberate about who and how you're publicly recognizing, and show vulnerability. Balance fact and process updates with sentiment. So we spent most of today's webinar discussing how you can better serve your teams. However, remember, you cannot pour from an empty cup. To lead and support others through change and business as usual, effectively, you must take care of yourselves too. And we'll have one last poll, just to, again, hear from you around how you might actually use this model, and then we'll finish with some questions and answers where you can add your questions to the chat. So Jess, our producer, will bring us to the Menti. And again, this will be 2 quick questions, and we'll then finish up for the session. So you can either scan the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen or enter the 8 digits on menti.com. The 8 digits are 38326108.
Or click on the link in the chat.
Or click on the link in the chat. Thanks, Neela. So we'll just go to the first question. Where do you believe your organization ranks in how they demonstrate these 4 leadership behaviors? So this is sort of an organization-wide view. In wherever you are working, where do you think you rank from 1 to 10, 1 being not even a little bit, to 10 being all day, every day, across the 4 leadership behaviors we've talked about today? Being authentic, being accessible, visibly empowering, and showing vulnerability. So right off the bat, there's a bit of a trend showing. So most organizations have a bit of a stronger sense of being authentic and accessible than maybe they do visibly empowering and showing vulnerability. So that's very interesting. And maybe, I don't know, Neela, are you surprised by that?
I'm quite interested in the vulnerability one. I think that is the one that people traditionally struggle most with in the workplace. So, but it does seem higher than I would have thought, which is great. You're clearly working with some brilliant leaders.
Absolutely. And then our second question: what do you think would this be of benefit to you or leaders in your organization to improve their leadership behaviors across the 4 elements we've talked about today? Let us know. Would this be something that you or leaders of your organization might benefit from? Definitely beneficial, good practical tips, very useful. Great. If there's anything missing, do let us know as well. Good touchstone reminders for the senior leaders, some clear tactics, and hopefully the structured tip sheet that we will share after this will give you those tactics that you can share with your peers and use yourself into the future. A good tip there is around if it was taken to another level where you include a step plan to help with each category. I really like that. Okay, we'll close the poll there and I'll hand back to Neela.
Brilliant. So that concludes the webinar. We are at time, but if anyone has any questions, then Donal and I are happy to stay for an extra few minutes. Feel free to pop anything in the chat. If there's nothing immediately on your mind, we've just left our details here as well, and we'll follow up with 2 succinct pages of those top tips collated and the theory. So hopefully you can share those with your teams and use them. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions after this webinar as well. You're very welcome to get in touch with us through our emails. Okay, we do have some questions coming through. What's the most creative engagement tactic you have seen work? I'll go first. So one of the most creative ones, and it feels very simple because we're so used to seeing stuff like this in our personal lives, but it worked really, really well within a work context. I think they were just these 3-minute spotlight videos on leaders. They were really fun. It was a blend of sort of the leader speaking to the camera and some visuals and some cartoons that surrounded that. And it was just leaders talking about what was important to them in their personal lives. It wasn't necessarily technology business priorities, but it was just trying to get to know them as a person, 2 to 3 minutes long. And it generated, I think, a lot more interest than anything else that was posted on those sites. And I really enjoyed them.
Share the most creative engagement tactic I've seen work would be to go back to the middle of 2020 in the height of COVID lockdown. We were asked to create a cookbook, and our globally diverse team all had to write a recipe from where they were based at the time. And it was a really good way of humanizing people, having a bit of fun, a sense of belonging. I got to write about my favorite crisp sandwich recipe, which is an Irish classic. If you haven't tried it, I'd highly recommend it, and do ask me for the details if you want them. But a really good question. Thank you, Caro.
And then another question, if you could wave a magic wand and change how organizations and leaders approached hybrid engagement, what would be your priority change? I know mine. I don't want to influence you.
Go ahead, Neela.
I just think that we spend so much of our lives in meetings. So if there's any way that, we can make things a little bit more succinct and give people a little bit more time to just even go and grab a cup of tea between meetings, I think that would make a huge difference to our energy levels and how we're feeling throughout the day. So just being a little bit more mindful around how people are engaged up front and where you can save them time. It requires extra work, up front as you're designing those engagement models and plans. But in the long term, I think it really pays off for your employees.
I think off the back of that, it might not answer the exact priority change, but I think on all of our communications, I think we need to give permission to people to be their best selves, but also to look after themselves and not to assume people will ask for what they need. So that cup of tea thing is a great example of it. But in how you run your team meetings and how you run your projects, I think giving people the space to, of course you need to pick up your kids. Of course you need to start a bit later if you have commitments in the morning. Giving people permission to do that creates that sense of trust in your teams, and being mindful of some of the challenges of your disparate team members as well is always so important.
And then one final question before we wrap up for the day. Duncan asks, has anyone cracked the code of how to enable people in a room and people on a screen to participate equitably in one meeting?
I can tackle that one. So Duncan, great question. I am a firm believer in hybrid working, but I do believe in terms of hybrid events, I'm a big, I wouldn't say skeptic, but I think if you can do fully in person or fully virtual events, if they're that important, I think having that hybrid experience makes events extremely challenging. You notice Neela and I aren't located together, and none of our participants are located together. That makes this a more seamless experience. I will say, if you have a longer project what you can do is invest in having a single in-person intervention where you get all the benefits of social relationship building, of having a sense of fun, that sense of humanized meeting people. But then the rest of the project can be fully virtual. I think that's a better way of doing hybrid rather than actually having some people in person and some people not, which might not be the answer you were looking for, but that's a personal perspective.
I said that'd be the last question, but I really love this one from Deborah. So this will actually be the last question. Deborah says, I was just wondering if the topic of neurodiversity has popped up in terms of accessibility and engaging employees within a hybrid workplace. It's a topic I find colliding with hybrid working issues more and more. I'd love to answer this one. So the topic of neurodiversity, for me and the engagements that I've worked on, it has come up, but it tends to be driven by younger generations and a younger workforce who seem to be a lot more comfortable with talking about neurodiversity and their needs. And typically in the beginning of engagements, they will say things like, hey, I've heard people say these in sessions, just so you know, I actually have ADHD, which means that the way I like to receive information is like this. The way that I like to operate in calls is like this. And it was quite striking to see that for the first time, because again, to that vulnerability point, people don't normally, typically up until now, discuss those sorts of issues in the workplace. And so if that topic isn't necessarily being driven by younger members of your workforce, you then really need to think about how leadership creates a safe space for people to talk about that. So how are you fostering psychological safety? It could be something as simple as in your kickoff sessions, you know, you're opening the door for people to share these sort of stories in a way that says, how do you want to receive information? It doesn't necessarily need to be, you know, tell me about your neurodiversity needs. It could just be, how would you like to receive information? And people will bring up those needs in that way. But it's really about how leaders role model and create a space for people to be vulnerable and ask. Training events too, and some on the spectrum do not like icebreakers and so choose to come afterwards once they know the timetable. Yeah, that's true. That's true. If anyone has any more questions, I love these questions, then please feel free to reach us via email, and we'll be in touch with everyone to share those top tips as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.